Hello everyone. For the next couple of minutes, I will be telling you about my experience working 503 days on open source full-time. And there's a big disclaimer that I think is very important, and that is this talk is not a technical talk, it's a subjective talk. And that's important for two reasons. The first is that I'm better with technical talks. I'm not saying I'm good, I'm just saying I'm better. So subjective talks and these kinds of talks for me present a bigger challenge. And also, I will be telling you about my personal experience and my opinions and the things that I have learned. And those only make sense within the context of my personal life. Yours might be similar. The things I will tell you might make sense, but they don't necessarily make sense, all right? And that's okay, there's nothing wrong with you, there's nothing wrong, there's plenty of things wrong with me, but not the subject of the talk, all right? So this is a very important disclaimer, and I thought this was something obvious. I didn't need to include such a disclaimer, but apparently there's this random person online that read, so there's a written version of this talk, and that person read through the written version and then remarked that these lessons feel very similar to the lessons learned working at a mid-sized company. And I was like, okay, maybe. I never worked at a mid-sized company, so I don't really know. But I changed the title of the talk. Now it's 503 days working full-time on open source, lessons that I learned, but that aren't necessarily unique to free and open source software, and that you might have learned or might still learn in other personal or professional contexts. So with that out of the way, the agenda for today. I will be grouping the lessons that I learned into 4 major categories. I will be talking about how I got a job in tech and how you can get a job through a similar process, non-standard process. I will be talking about managing your ego. I'll be telling you about how to make it easier to interact with users, and by the end, I will be telling you how I managed to work with a code base that didn't fit inside my brain completely. So these are the 4 main key points that I'll be going through. Are we good to start? Yeah, all right. So I'll wake you up when we get to the 2 most important things. So you can fall asleep now if you want. And when I get to the key takeaway for this talk, I will wake you up. So getting a tech job, there's plenty of ways of doing that, of doing it. I'm not saying the thing that I did is the only way, because clearly plenty of people have tech jobs and not everyone did the same thing that I did. So mileage may vary. But the key thing, the thing that I want to talk about and that I think is important is that everything that you do online acts as a banner for yourself. Everything you do online is free publicity. It can be good publicity or bad publicity, but it is publicity. So make the most of it, or at least try, so that the things that you do and show up online don't act against you. And more particularly, what I mean here, or the things that I'm actually referring to, can you see the red dot? You can't. Okay, so I will not be using it. The things that I'm talking about refer specifically to the work that I do online, teaching Python and sharing Python tips and being active on Twitter, writing on my blog. So those things that take up way too much time, you can ask my wife, those things, the investment, the time investment you put into those can actually pay off. It's not a given, right? It's not a given, but it can play an important role in favor of your own person. And one thing I want to say, and I want to link to this, and I hope you don't get me wrong, so let me finish my thoughts, and then you can draw your own conclusions, is that luck is not 100% random. So there is a part of luck that is random. But it's not all of it, right? It's not equally. Your chances of being lucky by being here today and by talking to people, they're different than what those chances would be if you stayed at home, if you didn't come to PyCon Portugal. Or those chances would be different if you went to a different conference. right? So the people you talk to, the things that you do, the contexts in which you put yourself willingly, they affect how likely you are to be lucky. There's still going to be a random part, and the random part blessed me, don't get that wrong, but I also did things that made it more likely that I would be lucky. And I created this slide before, but now I have a second data point. So this is about a job I had. Now I have a new one, which I got in a completely different way because I was lucky. All right? So I've reproduced my own results. So I'm either doing something right, or I just have dumb luck. I don't know. I like to think that I'm doing something right, and you can too, maybe, hopefully. So now let's go into my favorite part of the talk, which is managing your ego. I have the awareness, I'm aware that when I was a younger kid, I was way too arrogant, and I was essentially a pain in that part of the body that you know. And I don't know, well, I'm not going to say that word just in case. So I was way too confident, and that affected the way I related to people, and I think I'm better now. But I still have a pretty big ego, or I think of myself quite highly, and part of that is healthy, and part of that might not be a good idea if I don't know how to manage that and how to interact with people, right? And so why am I talking about this, and why is this relevant? Because when I joined this company, I knew, and this is factual, for the first time in my life, I was not going to be the best Python developer in the room. Because in the previous rooms I was at, I was the only Python developer. So by definition, I was the best one. But this time, I was not going to be alone, and I was not going to be the best one. And I knew beforehand that I would need to take this opportunity, because if you're surrounded by people who are better than you, and if you can live with that, and if you can make the most of that, you can learn a lot. And I knew one thing I needed to do was ask all the questions. Whatever the situation, I needed to ask. If I had a question, if I wasn't sure why they were doing something, if I wasn't sure why they asked me to change something that I did, I would need to ask why. Because if you think about it, programming, I'm not going to say that it's the only one, but it's definitely one of the few jobs where it's important if you get to the correct result. That's the point. But it's also important, the way you get there is also important. It's not only about whether your code does what it's supposed to, it's also about whether your code looks good, maintainable, readable, it adheres by the standards your company or your team follows. That's why we do code reviews. It's not only to spot bugs, it's also to check the code in and of itself. Right? Does this make sense? Okay, excellent. And so I knew that when they reviewed my code, I would need to take the opportunity to ask them, why do you think I should change that? And not in an arrogant way, but in an honest way. If you think it's a better idea, would you mind explaining me why? Because maybe next time I can do it better on the first pass, and we don't need to waste our time going back and forth. And with that, I knew I would have to embrace feedback. Feedback, it's nice when they tell you, Rodrigo, what a nice piece of code you wrote. It feels good. And doesn't feel as good if they just say, Rodrigo, please, what are you doing? That's not so great, but if they provide constructive criticism, then that's the best type of feedback you can get. And it might sting a bit, but if you manage to swallow your pride just enough to actually read the concrete suggestions, and if you ignore the part where it just hurts a bit, and if you take a look at the objective things that you stand to gain from the review feedback, that's the best thing you can do. And I was mentally prepared for that. And let me actually go back, because I don't always remember all of the things I want to say, but this particular thing I really want to say it. And this is particularly funny because I have a background in math, so implications, there's something I'm well aware of. And I've heard, I've read, I've listened to people say that intelligent people, they are not afraid of asking questions, because it's not, just because you don't know something doesn't mean you're not intelligent. So intelligent people ask questions. And so I try to do the reverse. I ask the questions so that maybe that makes me more intelligent. I try. It's an ongoing process. I'll let you know how it goes. All right, so now I'm going to show you something very funny, at least for me. This was the project I was working on, just because I know you're probably dying. Now that you know that I was working at Textual, you can now fall asleep. Everyone was thinking, where was Rodrigo working? So I was working on this framework, and this was a PR. This was one of the first PRs I made. This was one of my first contributions. And Will asked for one request. Not too bad, right? This was 11 days after I joined, and I made the PR, and Will only had one request. One is better than two requests, right? Because it's fewer requests. And you would think that with practice I would get better. But a couple of weeks later, Will had a few requests. And this kept going. I kept making pull requests, and Will kept asking for changes. And one day, it felt like I nailed it on the first try. But it was Dave that accepted the changes. So Will then came and said, no, this actually needs a couple of more changes. And this just keeps going. And this is obviously a caricature of the time I spent there, because these are not all of the pull requests I made. Also not all of the changes requested I got. But this is not all of my work. And I'm also not showing you what my colleagues did, because this is part of the process, right? Everyone makes mistakes. I don't always come up with the best solution ever on the first try. Other people have other experiences, and remember, they're more experienced than I am, so they've seen different problems, they've worked in different places, so they know different things. So it's reasonable to expect that I'm not going to get everything at the best possible level on the first try always. That's pretty reasonable. And the same thing happened with them, obviously. And again, if you're doing code reviews, if your code is being reviewed and if they ask you to change something, if you really believe your option was the best, ask, why do you think I should change? And if you're reviewing their code and you see something you don't understand, ask, why do you think this is best? Why didn't you do X, Y, Z? And they either tell you, because I did consider X, Y, Z, but I was working on this, I spent more time thinking about it, and I concluded it was a bad idea because of ABC. And then you learn about ABC. Or they actually say, oh, wow, I kind of forgot about X, Y, Z. So yeah, that's actually better. So it's a win-win. I really don't see the downside of asking questions. I don't. You can, when we get to the Q&A, you can fight me on this. But like the last speaker said, you're going to be wrong. But yeah, we can talk, of course. I'm open to dialogue. Everyone makes mistakes. We saw that. This is important. Age-old adage. I got it. It's the age-old adage, but it just makes sense, and I had to put it there because I kept making mistakes, and the way they handled my mistakes was very gracious, and it just puts you in a comfortable position. You don't want to do the same mistake twice. That's borderline. I think Einstein defined stupidity as making the same mistake twice. I might be completely wrong. You can never trust the quote sources on the internet, but something like that. So don't make the same mistake twice, but making an honest mistake is a good thing. Assuming you spend time thinking about what you're doing. If you just couldn't arrive at the correct conclusion, I think that's reasonable. So bear that in mind. And this is a bit more self-deprecating humor. This was the lowest point of my career. Probably, literally, this was the lowest point of my career. I stripped the context because I'm ashamed of what's above my reply. If you boil it down, we can talk about it later. I can give you more details so you actually understand what went on. But I essentially opened a bug report that said, folks, so I ran the code. I hope you're sitting for this. And the code ran. This was my bug report. If you strip away the context, if you look at the core message of my bug report, it said, I ran the code and the code ran, this is wrong. And Dave very calmly replied, Rodrigo, are you sure that's a bug? It looks pretty okay to me. You know, if you run the code is supposed to run. And then I closed the issue in shame. Thankfully, I was working remotely, so I could cry alone in my corner. They didn't see that. That was a relief. Now let's go on and talk about the worst thing that can happen to your open source projects. Users. Which is also the best thing. You just have to know how to manage things, how to manage expectations. And for me, this section of the talk is actually something that I wish people would have told me earlier because of my nature. And again, this is maybe the most subjective part of the talk because my nature is, I'm not very confrontational in some situations, or I try to be agreeable. Yes, and sometimes that puts me in interesting spots when I'm interacting with users on issues or pull requests. And the very first tip that I have, the very first thing, actually it's not the first thing I learned, but it's the thing I'm showing you first. And if you're sleeping, now is the time to wake up. If you only take one thing away from this talk, please let it be that you should create a contributing guide. Please create a contributing guide. No one will read it at first, but it's still going to be helpful. The contributing guide will have your back in a number of situations. If I don't forget any throughout my talk, I'm going to mention like 5 of them or so. So create a contributing guide. You can fall back to sleep now. The first thing you can do after creating the contributing guide is making sure that you give clear instructions to the people that report bugs on your project. And we know that in an utopian world, everyone has heard of MREs, the minimal reproducible examples, and everyone has the time to create good MREs, and everyone presents an MRE when they open a bug report. But that's in an utopian world. In the real world, people will open issues that you can't even understand from the linguistic point of view, let alone the implications in your code. So if you're, and this is now a very GitHub-centric tip, if you work with GitHub, you can actually create issue templates so that when the user goes on your project and clicks the new issue button, they are actually presented with a couple of different things they can pick from. And these options, they can be, well, they're templated. So you can include useful information to guide the user in filling the report or in requesting a feature or whatever. And one of the things that you're going to do in your issue templates is, can you guess? Refer to the contributing guide. So contributing guide 1, users 0. We're getting started. Do this. In your contributing guide, be very verbose, very clear, set the expectations, tell the user, please do X, Y, Z when you submit a bug report. And when the user submits the bug report and they do not do X, Y, Z, because most of them will not, and it's not because they want to be annoying, it's just they didn't, you refer back to the contributing guide, because the contributing guide will outline what you expect and what you need, and it's going to make it much easier for you to actually try and fix that bug, or try and work on that feature that they're requesting. So the contributing guide is a very important document, in my opinion. And the next thing that I think is so important, and one thing I strive to do, is that when you're interacting with your users, you should be so kind it's annoying. And this is I know people who disagree with this point of view, and that's fine. But I try to take this stance. I try to be so kind it's annoying. And I do this in part because I believe in some sort of karma. When I tend to be nice, people tend to be nice to me, so that's actually good. but also because you're interacting with people through text, which is not the perfect medium to convey emotions. And you're interacting with people whose first language is not English. And sometimes they just have a hard time coming up with the right words to actually say what they want to say. One time I insulted a user by mistake because I used the false friends. A word that in Portuguese means something sounds very similar to a word in English and doesn't mean the same thing. And by mistake, I kind of insulted the user. Thankfully, the user knew me already from previous interactions, and a native English speaker also went past and said, Rodrigo, maybe you didn't mean to use that word. And then I looked it up, and I didn't. But okay, so mistakes can happen. So when someone writes something that looks a little bit rude or aggressive, I think to myself, okay, maybe that person is not a native English speaker and cannot express their thoughts as eloquently as they would have liked. Maybe this is true, maybe this is false, doesn't matter. I choose to believe it's true, and it helps me when interacting with others. And another thing, give your first reply quickly. I think it's important that if someone opens an issue or opens a pull request, you should give a first reply quickly. It doesn't have to be a complete code review. It's just a first reply. Say, hey, thanks for your time. I'll get back to this ASAP. This is if you do this and then you take 3 months to review the pull request, it's one thing. If you say nothing and take 3 months to review the pull request, it's a completely different thing, and the user still had to wait 3 months. Trust me, it's not the same thing. First reply quickly. And take the opportunity to skim through whatever was done, and if you spot things that are out of place, refer to the contributing guide. You're saving everyone time. Hey, look, I noticed that you did something not in the best way for us. Can you please refer to the contributing guide for our style guide, for example? And that saves time. Actually, I forgot to start my timer. Okay, so, Sage, all right. So just checking the time because I have a timer here. But it's at 0. So I still have 30 minutes, right? So let me start the timer now.
Can we go back to sleep now?
Exactly, you can go, you can go back to sleep now. Alrighty, so first reply, do it quickly, please. And to close off this whole section, let me tell you about handling external pull requests, which is an interesting experience for me. I've seen plenty of times, and I'm not that old, nor that experienced, so if I've seen this a bunch of times, most of you have seen something similar as well. There's this project, and a random person submits a random pull request out of the blue. Which is good, because it means that random people take enough interest in your project that they actually spend time to make a pull request. But also, maybe that pull request implements something that you don't want in your project, and that's fair game. Maybe it implements something you want, but it was designed in a way that you don't agree with. It's fair game. Maybe you actually agree with the design, but it doesn't follow your style guide. And I've seen this. There's hundreds of files. Every single function has a docstring. Every single docstring follows the same pattern, but somehow this user thinks that their functions don't need docstrings. Just take a look around. All of the code has docstrings. Why do you think your code doesn't need docstrings? So if that happens, you refer them to the contributing guide. Because even the smaller things, maybe your project only uses variable names with 5 letters. Maybe that's your thing. And if that's your thing and you actually enforce that, you should put that in the contributing guide. Because then when a user makes a PR and they do not follow that guideline, if you just go and say, hey, please change your variable names so that they only use 5 letters, that can sound kind of picky because it might be your style, but it's not materially important in the code, right? But if you just say, hey, as per the contributing guide, we only use 5-letter variable names. Now you're shifting the for the lack of a better word, I'll say blame. You're shifting the blame to the contributing guide. So the contributing guide acts as a shield. You just say, hey, the contributing guide says you should do X, Y, Z, so please abide by the contributing guide. It's not you saying to the user, look, I really want you to use 5-letter variable names. So this is the specific situation in which I found the contributing guide to be the most helpful. And there was some other points, some other examples, some other contrived situation I wanted to talk about. But essentially, just keep referring to the contributing guide. Make it as verbose as possible. And finally, some notes on closing. I don't mean merging, I mean closing PRs. One thing I find important, again, it's important to me because of the things I believe in and because of my experiences. Maybe you see it in a different way. But again, I think that this specific point, it's not about you, the maintainer or the contributor or the core contributor. It's about the other users contributing to your project. Imagine someone here with less experience on open source attends this talk. They also attended Sydney's talk yesterday, and they're surrounded by all of us who work with open source. Maybe not full-time, but in our spare time. Everyone is enthusiastic about it, and everyone says, you should contribute, you have to contribute. And then they enthusiastically open their favorite project, they forget to read the contributing guide, and they make a pull request out of the blue, and it's actually something that users already requested 5 times, and you already justified 5 times that you don't want. And so you essentially have to close that PR. If you just close it, it's going to be a hit to the person that just did all of the work, even though it was redundant. It's going to be a hit. And so what I try to do, it's obviously not always possible, but what I try to do is I try to take a look at the PR and see, is there anything in this PR that I could merge? Can I pick something that I could merge? Because if you can, you close the PR, but then you go ahead and merge the small change that was actually useful, and you add, and this is the most important thing, you add the other person as a co-author of the commit. And now suddenly this person has a contribution. And okay, maybe you had to throw away a big part of the PR, but if there was something that was actually salvageable, that can really make a difference because it gets them going and it helps them get momentum. Now, there's obviously no time for the story, so you have to ask me later. And finally, to close off the whole talk, let me give you a couple of notes on working on a big code base. And big is subjective. It depends on you. I'll define big as something that doesn't fit in your brain completely. So I was not able to fit in my memory all of the code, all of the details, all of the files. No way. And when I was working on code, and remember, I'm working on something that I do not understand entirely. There were 4 things I always kept in mind when writing code. And they were, I needed to think, if I'm implementing this issue, what's best for the developer that's going to use my code? I need to think about them. What do they need? What do they want? I need to think, this is big for me, what's the spirit of the issue? It's not what's literally written there, it's what's the point of what's written there. If you take this problem, take this string as input and produce this output, the way this is written, this is a valid reply. It's not the point of the question, but this works. And as a mathematician myself, I'm the kind of person that tends to do this, not on purpose to be annoying, but just because it works. I mean, it satisfies the requirements. So this was big for me. I needed to keep track of what is the purpose of what I'm doing, not just what's written there. I skip the point. I take the hit so that the dev that's going to use my code doesn't. If it's an annoying edge case, I have to cover for it. If it's boring to implement, who cares? I have to implement it so that the dev can actually use my code. And finally, when I'm making design changes and design decisions, with my choices now, am I possibly preventing something reasonable in the future? Is there a universe in which someone might want to be able to do something that my choices now prevent from happening. This was something important to keep in mind that I managed to constantly screw up, honestly. It's impressive. Just take notes, pretty standard advice. And the second best thing from this talk is my personal pull request checklist. I read an issue, I write some code, and then I ask myself, did I fix the whole issue? Because for some reason I would read an issue with 3 parts, implement the first and think, yeah, I'm done. And then go back to the issue, oh wait, I forgot about everything else. And if I haven't fixed the whole issue, then I write some more code. And if I did fix the whole issue, I'll go ahead and I'll run the tests. And then again, just to make sure. And after I run the tests, I take a look at my code and I check, did I actually remove all of the prints that I just added? Because more often than not, I didn't. So I would remove the prints and I would run the tests. And if I did, I would just run the tests either way, because you can never be too sure. And immediately before making the PR, I would ask myself, was running the tests the very last thing that I did? The very last thing that I did? Because if it wasn't, I would run the tests. And if it seems like I have an obsessive behavior here, it's because I do. Because I've managed to break CI with the most unusual things. I fixed documentation typos and managed to break CI with that. I've done amazing things, actually. Actually, they're engineering feats. I've made incredible things. So I just run the tests and then I make my PR. Now you can take a picture. This is the second best thing from the talk. And what I would also do is actually make a draft PR and take a quick look at my own PR first. Because more often than not, I would find something that actually needed changing. So I was the first person to review my PRs. In summary, maybe the 4 main things to take out of this. Everything you do online acts as a banner for yourself. Make sure at least it doesn't work against you. Be open to learning. Be kind and add a contributing guy to your project. And run the tests. My name is Rodrigo. Thank you so much for sleeping with me today. And if you are interested in the technical content I produce, you can find my books in this QR code. Thanks.
Thank you.